Hey again, everybody. Mr. Drummond coming to you here on April 23rd. Hope everyone's doing well. Got the news this week that school will not be coming back in person this year. So, you know, it's hard it's hard news to hear, but obviously, all of us teachers and staff want very badly to interact with you guys and to see you guys and to make sure everybody's okay and doing well. But we got to stay safe, and that's what we need to do for right now. So please be assured that we're not going. We're not going anywhere. We'll be here. We'll be here to help you. We're gonna continue to work and make sure that you're getting everything from us that you need. Okay, so make sure that you're reaching out to teachers, whether it's me or any other teacher. I've talked with a lot of the teachers at East, and we've all said that how good it feels to hear from students, and when a student reaches out, and when we can get in touch with a student, we really that really is a great that's great for us. We really like to hear from you guys. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything. All right. I thought what I would do today is go over the answers or go over the reading that I assigned earlier in the week. Excuse me, gave you guys a little time to work on it, and now we can go over it together. And I thought I'd just read through it a little bit, talk a little bit, and then go over the responses at the bottom of the reading. So the thing that we're working on is the thing that was posted on Classroom and on Progress Book. I posted it on Sunday night. It was our assignment for this week. So I just want to make sure everyone knows where we're going. It's about constitutional principles, okay? And I posted a video about this earlier about the constitutional principles, so you can go back and watch that. But I thought, it would be good to actually go over the answer so that you have it, so that you can know, make sure you're on the right track. So without further ado, we'll just start with some reading, okay? And then once we get through the reading, there are 5 sections of little couple of questions each, talking about constitutional principles, okay? So let's begin, okay? First things first, the first of its kind. It may sound dramatic to say the U.S. Constitution revolutionized the world, but that's exactly what it has done. Since the Constitution was adopted in 1791 as the foundation for government in the United States, nations across the world have created their own constitutions modeled largely after ours. What makes the U.S. Constitution so popular? The principles behind it. At the time it was written, the U.S. Constitution represented a complete reversal from the kind of governments people were used to. Autocratic, remember, autocratic means kind of almost totalitarian power. No rights reserved to the people, complete control by the people in government. Autocratic, all-powerful systems where citizens had little or no power. For the first time, a group of citizens had freed themselves from that kind of government and created a brand new system where government was responsible for the people it governed. So responsible to the people it governed. So remember, we've talked about this a lot. We take these ideas for granted, right? The fact that we go out and vote, and that we decide who the president is, and that we decide who our representatives are. Okay, we take that for granted, but when the United States Constitution was written, this was we call it the American Revolution, right? It was a revolutionary idea, okay? This is, the idea that people had natural rights, kind of those Enlightenment ideas were not that old, right? They had only in the last 100 years, which in historical terms is almost nothing, the last 100 years before the revolution. So, this is a wild experiment in self-government. Where power comes from. This is really the big, change in what we think. Where does power come from? Okay. Every nation's government has sovereignty. Remember, we've talked about that word a lot. Sovereignty, R-E-I-G-N, reign is right in the middle. That means power, okay? Absolute power within its own borders. So, you know, we talked about how how the United States makes laws for the United States, okay? Canada can't come in and tell the United States how to run its business. Mexico can't come in. Great Britain can't come in. And just likewise, we can't go into those countries and say how they run their show because they are sovereign, right? Sovereignty is another word for power and independence. For much of history, most of the world's governments were based on a system of nobility in which power was based on social class and passed down through families. America's founders wanted to flip that on its head. They believed in popular sovereignty. People, popular, sovereignty, power. People should have power. The principle that a government's power is derived from the people. Popular sovereignty may be the most fundamental idea behind the U.S. Constitution. You see it in the very first line. We the people, right? And we've talked about that, okay? We've met in my last video about constitutional principles. We talked about how we the people, right? That's what popular sovereignty is. Who's writing the Constitution? The people of the United States. Who's ratifying the Constitution? The people of the United States. Why do laws have to come under the Constitution? Because the Constitution was established by the people. The government was established by the people. So the laws of the government must follow the will of the people, which is written down in a Constitution. Okay. Throughout the Constitution, you can see a common theme. The states have a say in almost everything. That may not sound like popular sovereignty at first, but it is. How? Article 4 guarantees that voters in each state will have the right to elect their own state governments. So the ultimate power of state governments is the people. That means even where the Constitution gives power to the states, it's actually giving power to the people who elect the state governments. If you look closely at the government structure set up by the Constitution, you'll see how each part ultimately links back to the people, okay? Consent of the governed. Okay, this is an idea that we talked about a lot. This is one of those Enlightenment ideas that the United States kind of picked up and ran with. Most historical governments didn't care what their citizens thought about the government's actions. They didn't need to. When the people you govern don't have any way to kick you out of power, who cares what they think? It was exactly this situation that got America's founders so steamed that they started a war in order to create their own government. Consent of the governed goes hand in hand with popular sovereignty. You can't have government power derived from the people if the government doesn't need the people for its actions. So the consent of the governed. A government only has power because the people have said that it's okay, right? The people have given their consent, their permission to the government to govern. If a government doesn't have the consent or the will of the people, then it is no longer legitimate. It can no longer function as a government. We need to throw that government off and establish a new government. Okay? Consent of the governed is found everywhere in the Constitution, even though you won't find those exact words. It's all about how members of government are chosen. Under the Constitution, the governed, the people, give their consent, their approval, by voting. They also express disapproval by voting. But let's pause for a reality check. In practical terms, we can all see that citizens don't get to consent to everything the government does. Should we cry foul? First, take a look and see that the Constitution doesn't intend for citizens to be quite that involved. We're talking about a direct democracy here, where the laws are proposed and voted on by every citizen themselves, right? We have what we call a republic, right? A representative system where the people pick delegates, and they then go and act on our behalf. So we pick a member of the House of Representatives, we pick a member of the Senate, and they go and do our will, right? We delegate, we entrust that power to them, right? Rather than having every citizen have to vote on every law that comes up, okay? Okay, most governments in the 1700s, including the British government the Americans had just broken free from, had few, if any, limits on their power. Governments were usually led by kings or similar figures who gained power by birth and could essentially do anything they felt like. Even in places like Great Britain, where society had demanded some limits on government. And we talked about, you know, the English Bill of Rights. We talked about the Magna Carta. You know, people in Great Britain had demanded, you know, a modicum or a bare minimum of power, okay? But even in these places, the starting point was unlimited power. Reform movements aimed to restrain that power. By contrast, the Constitution's starting point is limited government. Under that principle, a government only has the power that's been given to it. Okay? Governments can't just do whatever they want. Where they have power, they have power. But where they don't have power, that's none of their business. Okay? To understand how the Constitution limits government, you need to understand who was actually creating the Constitution. The states and the people in those states. Each state was basically an independent nation that agreed to cooperate with the other states. The men who attended the Constitutional Convention wrote the Constitution as representatives of the state they lived in. When they wrote Articles 1, legislative branch, 2, executive branch, and 3, judicial branch, just so you can remember, they created the 3 branches of the U.S. government and assigned each branch certain powers. Their starting point was that states were the source of the federal government's power. The only powers the federal government would have were the powers assigned to it in the Constitution. Those delegated powers, those expressed and implied powers that we talked about. The states and the people in those states would keep the rest. Limited, seriously. Time for another reality check. Today's federal government doesn't seem very limited. So what's up? In one sense, nothing has changed. Americans still operate on the principle that the government is limited to what the Constitution says it can do. But over time, several changes have evolved. For one thing, society's ideas about the role of government has changed. Today, Americans generally feel it's appropriate for government to keep an eye on everything from airline safety to food contamination to children's well-being. For another thing, what the Constitution says requires interpretation because it doesn't say much. And the Constitution has been interpreted differently over time. In many cases, that has led to an expanded view of what the federal government's powers actually are. So remember, you know, we talked about implied powers, okay? And we talked about the example that we talk about would be, you know, there is an expressed, directly stated power that the federal government can raise an army, right? And a navy. Well, what do you need to have an army? In order to have an army, it's going to be necessary and proper. Remember that key phrase from the Constitution we talked so much about, right? Kind of the elastic clause that government can use to expand what it can do. All right, we're expressly stated, hey, you can have an army. Okay, you can have an army and a navy. Well, in order to have an army and a navy, it's going to be necessary and proper to have what? Soldiers and sailors, right? That's going to be a pretty weak army if you don't have anybody in it. So if it's necessary and proper to get people, soldiers and sailors, then it must be an implied power that the federal government can draft people, right? It doesn't say it anywhere in the Constitution, but it's implied based on the things that it does say. So it's based on interpretation, okay? All right. Limited by law. For the founders, limited government was about more than just defining which powers the government would have. In the British system of nobility, the law simply wasn't applied to nobles in the same way it applied to everyone else. At the same time, there was little to hold the government itself accountable to the law. This kind of government was missing the rule of law. The principle that society is governed by laws, not people. And you've heard me say that. That's a common theme, right? We are a nation of laws, okay? And that every person must live under those laws. The equal protection of the law, right? Every person has to have the law apply to them equally. Every person has to obey the law, whether they're the president or whether they're a newborn baby or anywhere in between, right? Well, that's not really true. We don't make babies follow the law in the exact, that's a bad example. Whether you are the most powerful person or the least powerful person in the world, okay? All right, let's move on from that. The rule of law states that no one is above the law, okay? The Constitution incorporates the rule of law as another way to limit government power. Article 6 establishes the Constitution as the supreme law of the land for the United States. The founders were especially concerned with making sure no single person could become an all-powerful leader. So Article 2 requires the president to take an oath promising to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Article 6 also requires members of Congress, judges, and government officials at both the federal and state levels to take an oath to support the Constitution, right? Not their political party, not their own personal advancement. They are there to support and defend and protect the Constitution of the United States, okay? Moreover, the Constitution does not make government officials immune from the law. Article 1 allows members of Congress to be prosecuted for crimes and sued for other violations. Article 2 allows the president to be removed from office. And Article 3 specifies that judges serving a lifetime appointment only keep their jobs during periods of good behavior. Failsafe against tyranny. For the founders, the principles described so far still weren't enough protection against runaway power. They wanted to build protection into the structure of government itself. Having one branch of government hold too much power could be just as dangerous as having one person hold too much power. So they created 3 branches. The separation of power among independent branches within the government itself was another layer of security. The Constitution separates power according to function. Article 1, legislative, makes the law. Article 2, executive, empowered to carry out the law or enforce the law. Article 3, judicial, power to interpret what the law says. Okay? The judicial branch also has the power to interpret the Constitution. We call that judicial review, right? Where courts, and then that's going to get into checks and balances, right? Where the courts look at what the Constitution says, they compare that to what a law says, and if a law violates the Constitution, the Supreme Court can strike that law down, all right? They must protect the Constitution, okay? Laws can never overrule the Constitution. Otherwise, what good is it to have a Constitution, right? If there's a Constitution, if there's a rule book, right? Say it's baseball, right? 3 strikes and you're out. Well, if I was a batter and I had 3 strikes and I said, you know what, I'm going to stay up here and keep swinging, well, then what good is it to have a 3-strike rule? The umpire has to have the power to say, no, buddy, you're out, all right? Have a seat, okay? I have a lot of experience with that. Trust me. All right. And a fail-safe against the fail-safe. Here's where we come into checks and balances. All right, so we want to separate the power, yes, but we also want to make sure that the branches are connected to each other in a way that allows them to check each other, okay? Even after separating power within a government, that wasn't enough for the founders. What was to keep one of the branches from going crazy and grabbing all the power for itself? Enter the principle of checks and balances, which gives each branch the ability to restrain certain actions the other branches take. In the Constitution, usually this shows up as one branch's actions requiring approval from another branch. Article 1 requires the president's approval before a law is passed, and it can go into effect. Article 2 requires the Senate's approval before a treaty the president makes with another country goes into effect. If the president commits a crime, Article 2 allows the legislative branch to conduct a trial and remove the president from office. The Constitution gives both the legislative and the executive branches a say over the judicial branch. The president has the power to nominate federal judges, but the Senate has to approve those. And between these fail-safes and all the other principles, the founders hope their Constitution would protect Americans' liberty for all future generations. Okay? So let's scroll down, or I'm scrolling, you're turning. Let's go all the way down to, you might be scrolling. I shared this one electronically. To where it says constitutional principles, and it has those quotes, all right? And it asks you some questions about those quotes. Let's get those done, all right, and make sure we're all good there. So, during the debate over the Constitution, James Madison made this argument. James Madison was a Federalist. He's writing in the Federalist Papers. We call this one the Federalist 45, right? So if he's a Federalist, that must mean he feels how about the Constitution? He likes it. He wants it to get ratified or approved. Okay. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. So what are we saying here? The federal government has a very few defined powers. Okay, and Madison, this is the argument Madison's making, right? We have the 10th Amendment that says anything we don't give to the federal government or deny to the states, when in doubt, the states get to do it. So what are we talking about? We're talking about federalism there, really, would be one way to describe it. This reading talks about it. I would say this is limited government, right? We're protecting the power, we're limiting the federal government's power. We're saying the states are going to continue to have control over this, okay? They're going to maintain an important role within the government, okay? Number 2, the Federalist 39. Again, the Federalist Papers written by a Federalist must mean they want what to happen to the Constitution. They want it to get passed. They want it to be ratified. The House of Representatives, like that of one branch, at least, of all state legislatures, is elected immediately by the great body of the people. Okay, so just like the state legislatures, at least one house of the state legislature chosen by the people. The House of Representatives is going to be the same way. The Senate derives its appointment indirectly from the people. Remember, this is before the 17th Amendment. State legislatures chosen by the people would pick senators. So they're saying the people still have a say there. Okay? The president is indirectly derived or chosen from the choice of the people. What do we have there? The Electoral College. The people appoint electors. The electors appoint a president. Even judges, with all other officers of the Union, will, as in the several states, be the choice through a remote choice of the people themselves. So what they're saying is, yeah, the president appoints federal judges and the Senate confirms them, but who picks the president and the Senate? The people. So even judges. He's saying that the people, when you should be picking up on a common theme here, the people have all the power. What does that sound like when people have power? Popular sovereignty. All right. The people are choosing. They choose their members of the House of Reps. After the 17th Amendment, they pick senators. They pick presidents through the Electoral College in an indirect way. And the people that they choose for those jobs appoint and confirm judges. So the people have power. Number 3, Article 2, Section 4. Article 2 talks about the executive branch. The president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So what are we saying here? The president and the vice president both still have to do what? That's right, they've got to follow the law. The idea that everyone must follow the law is the textbook definition of which constitutional principle or idea that we've been talking about today. The rule of law, right? No one's above the law, even presidents, according to the Constitution. That's how it always was, and should be. Okay. George Mason was an anti-federalist. So what's this quote going to be? Something going against the Constitution. One of these anti-federalist arguments that they don't like the Constitution. Okay? It says the president, that unnecessary officer, the vice president, who for want of other employment is made president of the Senate, thereby dangerously blending the executive and legislative powers. So what's George Mason, the anti-federalist argument? The vice president has no duty. And you guys were embarrassed when you wrote this, so you looked around and said, what could we have the vice president do? Let's make him the president of the Senate, all right? The vice president's a member of the executive branch. The Senate is a part of the legislative branch. So what is Mason worried about there? We're not going to be respecting which principle. If we've got the executive, somebody from the executive branch doing something in the legislative branch, those branches, in this guy's opinion, George Mason, they're no longer separate, right? They're getting conjoined together. That's separation of powers. Okay, last one. Federalist 48. So we're back to support for the Constitution, Federalist Papers. Unless the three branches be so far connected and blended as to give to each a constitutional control over the others, the degree of separation essential to a free government can never in practice be duly maintained. So what's Madison saying here? Yeah, we want them to be separate, but they need to be close enough to each other that they can do what? Keep an eye out on each other, right? Yes, we want them separate, but we don't want them unable to influence each other because we don't want one branch to run away with all the power. That's an example of what? Checks and balances, okay? So I hope this helped, okay? If you have any questions about what we went over, please send me an email. Please reach out on Remind. Please leave a message on Google Classroom. Do whatever you can to get in touch with me, or anything you want, or if you feel you need, you please let me know, okay? Hope this has been helpful. Hang in there. If anything's unclear, please make sure you get in touch with me. I'll check back in on you guys soon, okay? Thanks a lot and have a good day. Bye-bye.